In the glittering yet merciless world of 1888, London, a beautiful woman makes a devil's bargain. She is Elara Vance, a debutante with a ruined family, and her only currency is her hand in marriage. Her target, the wealthiest, most enigmatic peer in England, Alistair Beaumont, the Duke of Blackwood. He is a man with a heart of ice, a past shrouded in tragedy, and a fortune that can save her family. She planned to be his duchess, a beautiful ornament in his gilded cage. She never planned to see the man behind the mask, and she certainly never imagined that one rain-lashed night this cold, untouchable duke would shatter, confessing a truth that would change everything he couldn't live without her. The Vance family was a study in elegant decay. Their Mayfair townhouse, once a jewel of the season, now bore the subtle scars of neglect. The silk wallpaper in the drawing room was beginning to peel in a corner, obscured by a potted fern, and the silver, when polished, seemed thinner than it had the year before. For Elara Vance, these were not just signs of disrepair. They were the ticking hands of a clock counting down to her family's utter ruin. Her father, Sir Reginald Vance, was a man of impeccable charm and catastrophic financial sense. His investments had evaporated like mist on the Thames, leaving behind a mountain of debt owed to men who lacked his genteel nature. The true weight of this ruin, however, fell upon Elara's younger sister Rosalie. Frail since birth, Rosalie's delicate health required consultations with expensive specialists in Harley Street and periods of convalescence in the dry, warm air of the Italian Riviera luxuries that were now as distant as the moon. "There is one last play," Sir Reginald had said one evening, his face pale in the flickering gaslight, a stack of unpaid bills on the desk before him. One last desperate gambit. The gambit was Elara. At 21, Elara possessed a beauty that was both a gift and a burden. It was spoken of in the hushed tones of London's high society, her hair the colour of dark honey eyes, the shade of a stormy sea, and a poise that hinted at a strength far deeper than her delicate features suggested. This season she was not just to participate in the marriage market, she was to conquer it. Her target was not to be a love match, not a comfortable union with a respectable viscount. Her target was a lifeline. Her target was Alistair Beaumont, the Duke of Blackwood. The Duke was a legend, and not a particularly cheerful one. At 32, he commanded a fortune built on centuries of land ownership and shrewd modern investments in railways and shipping. He was staggeringly wealthy, devastatingly handsome in a severe, brooding way, and utterly untouchable. Society called him the Iron Duke, not for valor in battle, but for the impenetrable fortress he had built around his heart. He had inherited the title a decade prior, after a family tragedy that was never spoken of above a whisper, something involving his younger brother Thomas and a woman named Isabella. Since then he had remained unmarried, attending social functions with a chillingly polite indifference that discouraged even the most ambitious of debutantes. He needs a Duchess Elara's mother. Lady Annalise had reasoned her hands, twisting a lace handkerchief. Every great house needs a mistress, an heir. He is a man of duty. Appeal to his sense of duty. Elara's plan was more cynical. She would not appeal to his duty. She would appeal to his pragmatism. She orchestrated their meeting with the precision of a military campaign. She learned from her father's acquaintances that the Duke had a rare appreciation for classical Roman sculpture, a subject on which Elara, thanks to a forgotten but brilliant tutor, was surprisingly well versed. At a soirée hosted by the Marquess of Pembroke, she positioned herself near a marble bust of Augustus. When the Duke passed, his obsidian eyes sweeping the room with bored detachment, she made a quiet, informed comment about the artist's tooling technique to her companion just loud enough for him to overhear. He stopped. For the first time that evening, the mask of indifference slipped, replaced by a flicker of genuine curiosity. "You are familiar with the Flavian school, Miss Vance?" His voice was a low baritone, smooth but cold like river stones. "I find the transition from idealized republic portraiture to the verism of the early empire quite fascinating, Your Grace," she replied, meeting his intense gaze without flinching. Their conversation was brief, academic, and utterly devoid of the usual flirtatious banter of the ballroom. But a seed was planted. Over the next few weeks they spoke again at a garden party, and then at the opera. Elara never played the coquette. She was intelligent, poised, and she treated him not as a prize to be won, but as an equal to be engaged. She was offering him a partnership, not a girlish fantasy. The proposal, when it came, was as unconventional as their courtship. He summoned her and her father to Blackwood House in Belgravia, a monolithic stone mansion that seemed to absorb the London sunlight without reflecting any of it back. In a library panelled with dark mahogany, surrounded by thousands of silent, leather-bound books, the Duke laid out his terms. "Sir Reginald," he began, his eyes fixed on Elara, "I am aware of your financial predicament. The promissory notes held by Lord Ashworth and Mr. Davies are now in my possession." Sir Reginald paled, looking as if he might faint. Elara's heart hammered against her ribs, but her expression remained serene. "I require a duchess," Alistair continued, his tone that of a chairman closing a business deal. "I need a woman of grace, intelligence, and impeccable breeding to manage my households, host my political gatherings, and in due course provide an heir. I have no interest in the trappings of a love match. It is a vacancy I need to fill." He paused, letting the cold reality of his words settle in the silent room. "Miss Vance has demonstrated a temperament I find suitable. Therefore I propose the following. I will settle all your debts in their entirety. I will provide a generous settlement to you, Sir Reginald, and establish a permanent trust to ensure your daughter, Miss Rosalie, receives the finest medical care for the rest of her life." He finally turned his full attention to Elara, his dark eyes unreadable. "In return, Miss Vance will become my wife. She will perform the duties of the Duchess of Blackwood with the dignity and efficiency she has thus far displayed. It will be a contract. Her family will be secure. My line will be secure. Is this arrangement agreeable? It was a transaction, a cold, calculated purchase of a wife. There was no poetry, no affection, only the brutal honesty of their mutual desperation. Her father, flooded with a relief so profound it brought tears to his eyes, began to stammer his acceptance. But Alistair's gaze remained on Elara, waiting for her answer. This was it. The sacrifice she had been prepared to make. She would be wed to the Duke for his fortune. She would save Rosalie, she would save her parents from debtor's prison and public humiliation. All it would cost was her heart, a thing she was now convinced was a liability. Meeting the Iron Duke's cold stare with an equally steady one of her own, she inclined her head. "The arrangement is agreeable, Your Grace." A single decisive nod was his only reply. The deal was struck. The date was set. And as Elara left the oppressive silence of Blackwood House, she felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cool spring air. She had sold herself to save her family, but in the process, she had shackled herself to a man made of stone. The wedding was a grand but joyless affair, a spectacle of wealth and lineage for the benefit of society. Elara moved through it like a ghost in white satin, her smile a masterpiece of practiced perfection, her hand cold in the Duke's arm. Alistair was a formidable presence beside her, impeccably dressed, flawlessly polite, and as emotionally distant as a star. They were the picture of a perfect aristocratic union, and it was the most profound lie she had ever told. Their true marriage began not at the altar, but upon their arrival at Blackwood Manor, the Duke's ancestral seat in the heart of Northumberland. The manor was not a home. It was a fortress of grey stone that rose from the brooding, wind-swept moors like a jagged outcrop of the earth itself. It was magnificent, ancient, and as cold and unwelcoming as its master. Awaiting them in the grand entrance hall was the household staff lined up like soldiers for inspection. At their head was Mrs. Gable, the housekeeper, a woman who seemed to have been carved from the same granite as the manor. Her gaze was sharp, her posture rigid, and her welcome was delivered with the warmth of a winter frost. "Your Grace," she said, her eyes flickering over Ilara with thinly veiled assessment. "Welcome to Blackwood Manor." Ilara understood immediately. In the eyes of this woman, and likely the entire staff, she was an outsider, a London socialite of questionable motive who had somehow ensnared their solitary duke. She was not the mistress of the house. She was an intruder. For the first few weeks, Ilara felt like a prisoner in her own home. The manor's endless corridors were filled with the silent, watchful portraits of Beaumont ancestors, their painted eyes seeming to judge her with every step. Alistair was a phantom presence. He spent his days locked away in his study, managing his vast estates and business interests, and his evenings in the library. Their dinners in the cavernous dining hall were silent, tense affairs, the clinking of cutlery the only sound between them. They slept in separate wings of the house, the Duchess's chambers connected to the Duke's by a seldom-used door, a silent testament to the nature of their union. But Ilara was not one to languish. She had made a bargain, and she was determined to uphold her end. She had been bought to be the Duchess of Blackwood, and she would be the most efficient, competent Duchess England had ever seen. She began with the household accounts, which Mrs. Gable presented to her, with a look that dared her to find fault. Ilara, who had secretly managed her own family's dwindling finances for years, spent 3 days poring over the ledgers. On the 4th day, she summoned the housekeeper to the morning room. "Mrs. Gable." Ilara began, her voice calm and clear. "I notice we are supplied by a merchant from Alnwick for our linens, yet a mill just outside our own estate produces a finer quality cotton for a lower price. It would also employ local women. Please make the change," she continued. "Furthermore, the contract for tallow candles seems exorbitant. I believe beeswax from our own apiaries could be utilized more effectively, saving nearly £50 a quarter." She went on, pointing out 3 other areas of wastefulness, with quiet, unassailable logic. Mrs. Gable stood in stunned silence, her rigid composure faltering for the first time. She had expected a frivolous girl interested only in dress allowances and flower arrangements. She had found a woman with a mind like a steel trap. A grudging respect, the first crack in the ice, began to form. Ilara did not stop there. She walked the estate, speaking with the tenant farmers. She listened to their concerns about crop rotation and leaking cottage roofs, things the Duke's estate manager had dismissed as trivial. She learned their names, their children's names. In the evenings, she would draft meticulous notes for Alistair, leaving them on the silver tray outside his study. He never mentioned them, but within a fortnight, a shipment of slate tiles arrived for the farmers' roofs, and a soil expert was brought in from Durham. One evening, seeking refuge from the oppressive silence of the manor, Ilara wandered into the East Wing Gallery, a section of the house that felt older, less used. It was filled with art that was more personal, less formal than the grand portraits downstairs. There she found Alistair standing before a small, softly lit painting of a laughing woman with fiery red hair, her arm linked with a young man who shared the Duke's handsome features, but possessed a joyful, easy smile. He didn't seem to notice her. At first, his guard completely down. The look on his face was one of such profound naked grief that it stole the breath from Ilara's lungs. It was the first genuine emotion she had ever seen on him, a raw wound beneath the iron facade. Sensing her presence, he turned his expression, instantly shuttering back into its familiar, cold mask. "My brother Thomas," he said, his voice flat. "And Isabella." Before the accident, Ilara said nothing, merely nodding. For the first time, she saw him not as the Iron Duke, but as a man haunted by ghosts she couldn't begin to comprehend. A subtle shift began. Their silent dinners were occasionally punctuated by a question from him about the estate. He would ask her opinion on a new tenant lease or a dispute over grazing rights. He listened to her responses with a focused intensity that was both unnerving and flattering. He was beginning to see her not as a beautiful acquisition, but as a capable partner. The true test, however, came with the arrival of his cousin, Julian Croft. Julian was everything Alistair was not: charming, effusive, with a smile that was quick to come and slow to fade. He was the next in line for the dukedom, a fact that seemed to be his primary occupation. He arrived at Blackwood for an extended stay, his eyes gleaming with a curiosity that felt more like scrutiny. "My dear cousin Julian," exclaimed, kissing Ilara's hand with a flourish. "You are even more lovely than the London papers described. Alistair, you old rogue, keeping such a treasure to yourself in this dreary pile of rocks." Alistair's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Ilara is the Duchess of Blackwood, Julian, and this dreary pile is our home." Throughout dinner, Julian regaled them with London gossip, his stories witty and barbed. But Ilara felt his eyes on her, constantly trying to peel back her layers, searching for a weakness. He would subtly praise her beauty in a way that reduced her to an object, then ask pointed questions about her family, his tone dripping with false sympathy. The Vances of Mayfair, of course, he mused, swirling his wine. A most distinguished name. "I do hope Sir Reginald's recent misfortunes have not been too trying for you." It was a direct hit, a reminder of the sordid transaction that had brought her here. She felt Alistair's body tense beside her. This was the moment Julian hoped for, the moment she would falter, blush, or show her hand. Instead, Ilara met Julian's sly gaze with a cool, placid smile. "My father is a man of great heart, if not great business sense. But family is not a matter of fortune, Mr. Croft. It is a matter of loyalty, something I'm sure both you and the Duke understand perfectly." The rebuke was elegant, sharp, and perfectly delivered. Julian's smile tightened at the edges. Across the table, Ilara saw a flicker of something in Alistair's eyes. It wasn't warmth, not yet. But it was respect. Deep, ungrudging respect. That night, as she prepared for bed, she found a single perfect white rose lying on her pillow. There was no note. None was needed. It was a silent acknowledgement, a gesture that spoke volumes more than their stilted conversations ever could. The ice around the Duke's heart had not melted, but for the first time, Ilara Vance, the woman bought to be a duchess, dared to hope that a thaw might just be possible. The fragile truce established between Ilara and Alistair was a thing of quiet routine and unspoken acknowledgements. A shared glance over a book in the library, his subtle deference to her opinion in front of the estate manager, her discovery that he took his coffee with one sugar a detail she ensured the staff remembered. They were like two planets, slowly, cautiously finding a stable orbit around a shared center of gravity. But it was an orbit that could be easily disrupted. Julian Croft's continued presence at the manor was a constant, unsettling force, a moon pulling at the tides of their nascent understanding. Julian was a master of sowing discord. He would praise Alara to Alistair for her remarkable pragmatism, subtly implying she was cold and calculating. Then he would sympathize with Alara, remarking on how terribly lonely it must be for her at Blackwood, with a husband as dedicated to his work as Alistair. He was chipping away at the foundation of their arrangement, hoping to find the cracks. The breaking point and the turning point came with the storm. It descended on the moors with a sudden biblical fury. The sky turned a bruised purple, and the wind howled around the stone manor like a banshee. Rain lashed against the centuries-old glass of the windows. It was a night that forced everyone indoors, trapping them together in the flickering lamplight. A frantic message arrived from a tenant farmer on the far side of the estate. The river had burst its banks, and the water was rising rapidly, threatening the low-lying cottages, including that of the shepherd old Mr. Hemlock and his wife. The bridge was already impassable. The manager is in Newcastle, Alistair said, his face grim as he studied a map of the estate. There's no way to get a message to the village for help until morning. They can't wait until morning, Alara stated, her voice firm. She had visited the Hemlocks just last week. Mrs. Hemlock was frail and bedridden. The water will reach their cottage within the hour. There's nothing to be done, Julian said, with a dismissive shrug, pouring himself a brandy. It's a dreadful business, but one can't fight. Nature, can one? Alistair ignored him, his eyes still on the map. Alara saw the conflict in his face, the Duke responsible for his people warring with the man who kept the world at arm's length. There is another way, she said suddenly. The old bridle path across the ridge. It's higher ground. I walked it last month. It comes out just behind the shepherd's cottage. Alistair looked at her, a spark of surprise in his eyes. It hasn't been used in years. It would be treacherous in this weather. More treacherous than drowning in your sleep, she countered. A decision was made in that instant. A silent communication passed between them. Get your heaviest cloak, Alistair commanded, already moving towards the hall. I'll have the stablemaster ready the horses. Alistair, this is madness, Julian protested, rising from his chair. You are the Duke. You can't risk your life for a common shepherd. Alistair turned, and for the first time, Alara saw the Iron Duke unleash a flash of white-hot fury. They are my people, Julian. Their well-being is not a matter of convenience. It is my responsibility. A concept you have never managed to grasp. Riding through the storm was a terrifying, exhilarating ordeal. The wind tore at them, and the rain stung their faces like needles. Alistair rode ahead, a dark, powerful figure, against the raging elements, his presence a shield against the storm's fury. Alara, an accomplished rider, followed close behind her, fear eclipsed by a strange sense of purpose. Here, battling the raw power of nature, the titles and transactions fell away. They were just a man and a woman fighting for a common cause. They reached the cottages just in time. The water was already seeping under the door. With the help of the Hemlock's stunned son, they managed to move the old couple to higher ground, bundling them in blankets and taking them to a neighboring safer cottage. It was nearly dawn when they returned to the manor, soaked to the bone, exhausted, but bound by a new, unspoken camaraderie. As they stood dripping in the grand entrance hall, the firelight casting long shadows on the marble floor, Alistair turned to her. You were remarkable tonight, Alara, he said, his voice raw with fatigue. He reached out his hand, hovering for a moment, before he gently brushed a stray, wet strand of hair from her cheek. His touch was hesitant, yet it sent a jolt of warmth through her that had nothing to do with the roaring fire. We did what was necessary, Your Grace, she whispered, her heart pounding. Alistair, he corrected her, his dark eyes holding hers. My name is Alistair. It was a simple word, but it was a key turning a lock. He was no longer just the Duke. He was Alistair, and she for a moment was not just his Duchess. She was Alara. Julian was waiting for them in the morning room, his face a mask of false concern that curdled into something uglier when he saw the look that passed between them. The bond they had forged in the storm was a tangible thing, a threat to his ambitions, and he knew exactly where to strike to break it. A few days later, a letter arrived for Alistair bearing a London postmark. Alara saw him read it in his study, his face hardening, the iron mask slamming back into place with such force it was almost audible. He became distant again, colder than ever before. Their silent dinners returned, but now they were freighted with a new, heavy tension. Alara's attempts at conversation were met with monosyllabic answers. The warmth born in the storm had been extinguished by a new, unknown frost. Alara was confused and hurt. She had no idea what had changed. She did not know that the letter sent by an agent Julian had hired in London contained a detailed and damning report. It outlined her family's desperate debts. It included copies of the promissory notes Sir Reginald had signed, and it concluded with a speculative, poisonous flourish that Alara Vance, a famously beautiful and clever debutante, had masterfully targeted the wealthy but reclusive Duke of Blackwood in a cold-blooded scheme to save her family. Every action she had taken, her competence, her intelligence, her bravery in the storm, was now cast in a sinister light. To Alistair it was no longer evidence of her character. It was proof of the depths of her deception. She wasn't a partner. She was the most accomplished fortune hunter he had ever met, a woman who reminded him so painfully of another beautiful liar from his past, Isabella. The ghost he could never escape. The chill that descended upon Blackwood Manor was more profound than any winter storm. Alistair retreated so far into himself that he became a stranger to Alara once more, a polite, cold automaton who performed his duties as duke and husband with a terrifyingly vacant precision. The shared glances, the quiet moments of understanding, all vanished, replaced by a wall of mistrust that was as solid and impenetrable as the manor's stone walls. Alara was adrift in a sea of confusion. She replayed their night in the storm over and over, searching for a misstep, a word that could have caused this sudden retreat. Had his brief moment of vulnerability terrified him? Had she presumed too much by feeling a connection? The more she searched for an answer, the more the silence from him felt like a condemnation. Julian, meanwhile, thrived in the poisoned atmosphere. He was constantly at Alara's side, offering a sympathetic ear. "Alistair is a difficult man, my dear," he would say, his voice oozing compassion. "He has these moods. They stem from the tragedy, you know. He never recovered from what happened with Thomas and Isabella. He simply doesn't know how to trust, especially not a heart as lovely and pure as yours." Alara, desperate for any explanation, listened. She knew Julian was a viper, but his words held a sliver of what felt like truth. The name Isabella had been a spectre since she'd seen the painting. What happened, she finally asked him one afternoon in the garden, unable to bear the mystery any longer. Julian's eyes lit up with the grim satisfaction of a storyteller about to unveil his masterpiece. A terrible story. Isabella de Courtenay was Alistair's first and only love. They were to be married. She was vivacious, charming, everything Alistair was not. And then there was Thomas, his younger brother. Wild, handsome, full of life. It seems Isabella found she preferred the brother with the warm smile to the one with the heavy title. He paused for dramatic effect. Alistair found them together. There was a dreadful confrontation. Words were exchanged that could never be taken back. That night, Thomas, drunk and despairing, took a new unbroken stallion out of the stables. He was thrown, broke his neck, died instantly. Alistair blames himself. He blames Isabella. And he has sworn never to let another woman get close enough to betray him again. The story settled in Ilara's heart like a shard of ice. It explained everything: Alistair's coldness, his fear of emotion, his retreat after their moment of closeness in the storm. He had allowed a connection to form, felt the first stirrings of trust, and the ghost of Isabella had risen to warn him away. She felt a wave of profound pity for him, an ache for the boy who had lost his brother and his heart in one cruel blow. Her new understanding spurred her to action. She would not let him be consumed by his past. That evening she went to the library, where he sat staring into the fire, the incriminating letter from Julian's agent lying on the table beside him, though she did not know its significance. "Alistair," she said softly, her voice trembling slightly. "We need to talk." He looked up, his face a mask of cold fury. "Indeed we do, Your Grace. It seems there is much to discuss." He picked up the letter. For instance, this fascinating financial report, a detailed accounting of your father's debts to Lord Ashworth. Debts I now hold. Debts that were, I believe, the entire foundation of our arrangement. Ilara froze. The blood drained from her face. "It's all here," he continued, his voice lethally calm. "A perfectly executed plan. Find the wealthiest, most reclusive duke. Dazzle him with your intellect and beauty. Secure your family's fortune. I must congratulate you. It was flawlessly played. Your performance during the storm was particularly inspired. The concerned wife, risking all for my people. A master stroke. Each word was a physical blow. He thought it was all an act. He thought her care, her respect, her burgeoning feelings were all part of the deception. The truth that it had started as a bargain, but had become something more, was too complex, too nuanced to explain to a man who was now looking at her as if she were his mortal enemy. It wasn't like that, she whispered, her throat tight. Wasn't it? He laughed, a harsh, bitter sound that echoed in the vast room. You are no different from her. Isabella also wanted the title, the power, the security. When my brother offered a more amusing diversion, she took it. You all want something. You just happened to want money more than passion. Tell me, did you have a price in mind for my heart as well, or was that not included in the initial sale? The cruelty of his words, born from his own deep-seated pain, shattered her composure. Tears welled in her eyes, hot tears of anger and hurt. "How dare you?" she said, her voice shaking with rage. "You hide behind your tragedy and your title judging the world because you were hurt once. Yes, I married you for your money. I did it to save my family, to keep my sick sister from dying in poverty while my father rotted in prison. I did what I had to do, and I have never once lied to you about the nature of our agreement." It was you who called it a contract. She took a step closer, her eyes blazing into his. But what I did in the storm, my work on this estate, my respect for you, that was not part of the bargain. That was real. And if you are too blind, too buried in your own self-pity to see that, then you are more of a prisoner than I could ever be. Without waiting for a reply, she turned and fled the library, her heart broken. She had been sold to a stranger, to pay a debt. And now she was being condemned by him for the very terms he had set. Alistair stood alone, the letter clutched in his hand. Her words echoed in the silence, cutting through his rage and striking at the heart of his misery. You are too blind, too buried in your own self-pity. For the first time in a decade, a sliver of doubt pierced his armor of cynicism. He had seen her face, the raw pain and righteous fury. It was not the face of a calculating schemer. It was the face of a woman whose heart he had just, carelessly, cruelly broken. The ghost of Isabella had warned him, but what if, for the first time, the ghost was wrong? What if the woman who had just walked out of his life was not a painful echo of his past, but his only hope for a future? The thought was so terrifying, so alien, that he could only stand there as the fire died down, leaving him alone in the cold and the dark. The aftermath of their confrontation was a chilling, absolute silence. Ilara confined herself to her wing of the manor, the unspoken declaration of a house divided. She took her meals in her rooms and communicated with the staff through notes. She was the Duchess of Blackwood, in name only a ghost haunting the eastern corridors. The great manor which had begun to feel like a potential home was once again her prison. For Alistair, the house became a torment. Every empty chair at the dining table, every silent hallway, screamed her absence. Her furious, heartbroken words replayed in his mind relentlessly. "I did it to save my sick sister." He had known of Rosalie, of course, but he had dismissed it as part of the tragic backstory, designed to elicit sympathy and justify the marriage bargain. He had never considered the depth of sacrifice behind it, the sisterly love that drove Ilara to shackle herself to a man like him. Julian Croft, ever the opportunist, saw the chasm between them and sought to widen it. He visited Alistair in his study, a look of grave concern on his face. "I fear the Duchess is not adjusting well, Alistair," he said smoothly. "She seems withdrawn. Perhaps the pressures of her new station combined with her family's delicate situation are too much for her." He let the insinuation hang in the air. "She is unstable, she is cracking." But something in Julian's solicitous tone grated on Alistair. He looked at his cousin, at the flicker of satisfaction in his eyes, and a seed of suspicion, long dormant, began to sprout. It was Julian who had first drawn his attention to Ilara's family debts. It was Julian who constantly reminded him of Isabella. It was Julian who stood to gain everything if Alistair's marriage failed and produced no heir. "Thank you for your concern," Julian Alistair said, his voice clipped. "I am quite capable of attending to my wife's needs." Alistair began his own quiet investigation. He wrote to his solicitor in London, a man of unimpeachable discretion, named Mr. Althorpe, asking him to look not only into the Vance family's finances, but into the source of the anonymous letter he had received. He also sent a letter to Dr. Armitage Rosalie Vance's physician under the guise of a concerned benefactor, inquiring about the girl's condition and prognosis. While he waited for answers, a different kind of crisis struck. A message arrived by telegram from Mayfair. Rosalie had taken a severe turn. Her lungs were weak, her fever high. She was calling for Ilara. Without a second thought, Ilara packed a small bag. She did not ask the Duke's permission. She simply ordered the carriage. As she was sweeping through the main hall, Alistair emerged from his study, blocking her path. "Where are you going?" he demanded, his face taut. "To London." "My sister needs me," she replied, her voice cold and brittle. "Do not try to stop me." "I won't," he said, his intensity startling her. "I'm coming with you." The journey to London was undertaken in a tense, near-complete silence, the clatter of the train wheels filling the void between them. But it was a different kind of silence now. Ilara was too consumed with worry for Rosalie to spare any energy for anger, and Alistair seemed lost in a turbulent sea of his own thoughts. When they arrived at the Vances' townhouse, the air of quiet desperation was palpable. Rosalie was pale and struggling for every breath, her small frame lost in a mountain of pillows. But her eyes lit up when she saw Ilara. "You came," she whispered, her voice frail. "Of course I came. Ilara said, taking her sister's hand, her carefully constructed composure crumbling at the sight of Rosalie's suffering. Alistair stood awkwardly in the doorway, a giant, brooding figure in the delicate, faded room. He was a witness to a scene of profound love and fear, and it moved something deep within him. This was not an act. The love between these sisters was the most real and powerful force he had ever encountered. Over the next few days, Alistair watched Ilara. He saw her sit by Rosalie's bed for hours on end, bathing her forehead, reading to her, her voice a low, soothing murmur. She barely ate, she hardly slept. There was no duchess here, no society beauty. There was only a terrified older sister, willing to do anything to comfort the person she loved most in the world. During a moment when Ilara had finally been persuaded to rest, Alistair found himself alone with Sir Reginald in the study. The older man looked broken, aged a decade in a matter of days. "I did this to them," Sir Reginald said, his voice thick with guilt. "My foolishness. It forced Ilara into this situation. She has a will of iron, Your Grace. Always has. She would burn herself to ash to keep the rest of us warm." It was then that a messenger arrived with a packet for the Duke. It was from his solicitor, Mr. Althorpe. Alistair opened it, his hands not quite steady. The contents were damning. Dr. Armitage's letter confirmed Rosalie's severe and chronic condition, noting that only the new expensive treatments funded by the Duke's trust had kept her stable this long. Mr. Althorpe's report was the true bombshell. He had traced the source of the anonymous letter. The information had been gathered by a private investigator, a man named Finch, who was known for his less than scrupulous methods. And Finch's fee had been paid in cash by a man matching the description of none other than Julian Croft's valet. The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. Julian's fake sympathy, his constant whispers about Isabella, the perfectly timed arrival of the letter, it had all been a calculated, venomous plot to destroy his marriage and secure his own inheritance. Julian had not just manipulated him. He had weaponized Alistair's own tragic past against him. He had used the ghost of Isabella to blind him to the truth of Ilara. A wave of self-loathing washed over Alistair, so potent it almost buckled his knees. He had been a fool, a puppet dancing on the strings of his own trauma, manipulated by a man he should never have trusted. And in his blindness, he had taken a woman of incredible strength and loyalty, a woman who had weathered a real storm to save his people, and he had accused her of the very sins that resided in his own cousin's black heart. He had broken her trust and quite possibly her spirit. He looked from the damning report in his hands towards the hallway that led to Rosalie's room, where Ilara was keeping her vigil. Saving her family had been her mission. Now he realized with a terrifying certainty, saving her earning back her trust, her respect, and perhaps impossibly, her heart had to be his. The Duke of Blackwood, the man who felt nothing, was finally consumed by a feeling so powerful it terrified him, a fragile, desperate hope. Rosalie's fever broke 2 days later. The crisis passed, leaving her weak, but on the slow road to recovery. The relief in the small Mayfair house was a tangible thing, a collective shuddering exhale. Amidst this fragile peace, Alistair knew he could not delay his own reckoning any longer. The lies that had nearly destroyed them had been exposed, but the wounds he had inflicted remained. He found Ilara in the small, overgrown garden behind the townhouse. A soft London drizzle was falling, misting the air and dampening the stone bench where she sat. Her shoulders slumped with the weight of exhaustion and lingering sorrow. She didn't seem to notice the rain her gaze lost somewhere in the grey distance. He approached slowly, his footsteps muffled by the wet grass. He held no title in this moment, no wealth, no power. He was just a man stripped bare of his defenses, about to plead for the one thing his fortune could not buy. "Elara," he said softly. She looked up, startled. Her face was pale with dark circles under her eyes, yet the rain on her skin made her look ethereal. Her expression was guarded, weary. She did not invite him to sit. "Rosalie is sleeping peacefully," she said, her voice flat. "The doctor says she will recover. You have upheld your end of the bargain. Your family will have its heir, and mine will have its health. You are free to return to Blackwood whenever you wish." She was releasing him, not just from London, but from any pretense of a real marriage. They were back to the contract, the cold, hard lines of their original agreement. It was what he deserved, and it was a fate he suddenly found unbearable. "I'm not talking about the bargain," he said, his voice hoarse. He remained standing before her, accepting her distance as his penance. "I'm talking about us." A bitter, humorless smile touched her lips. "There is no us, Your Grace. There is a duke who required a duchess, and a woman who required a benefactor. The transaction is complete. It was never just a transaction to you," he countered, taking a step closer. "I know that now. What you did for your sister, the way you managed the estate, the way you rode with me into that storm. That isn't a duchess performing her duties. That is a woman of courage and loyalty. A woman I was too blind and too damaged to see." He saw a flicker of something in her eyes, surprise, confusion, but the wall remained. "What has changed?" she asked, her voice laced with suspicion. "Have you simply decided to revise the terms of my employment?" The sting of her words was sharp and fair. He had to give her the whole truth, no matter how much it cost him. "I know about Julian," he said. The name hung in the damp air between them. "I know he hired an investigator. I know he sent that letter. I know he has been whispering poison in my ear from the moment you arrived, playing on my past, using my own history as a weapon against us." Elara's eyes widened slightly. This she had not expected. "He reminded me of what I lost." Alistair continued the words, coming in a torrent, now a confession held back for a decade. "My brother Thomas. He was my opposite, full of light and laughter. And Isabella. I thought I loved her. I thought she was my future. When I found them together, it wasn't just the betrayal that broke me. It was the words I said to my own brother. Vile, unforgivable things. He left and he never came back. For 10 years I have lived with the belief that my anger killed him." He finally looked at her, his soul bared in his dark eyes. The Iron Duke was gone, replaced by a man drowning in grief. I wrapped myself in bitterness and mistrust, because it was easier than facing the truth that I was a coward. I let one betrayal define my entire life. When you came along so beautiful, so capable a part of me, was terrified. You challenged the bitter, lonely world I had built. Julian saw that, and he fed the beast. When that letter came, it confirmed my darkest fears. It was easier to believe you were another Isabella than to admit that I was feeling something for you. Something real. The rain was falling harder now, plastering his dark hair to his forehead, dripping from his chin. He didn't seem to notice. When I saw you here with Rosalie, I finally understood. The sacrifice you made wasn't for a title or for luxury. It was for love. A love so fierce, you were willing to chain yourself to a man of ice for it. You were willing to enter a loveless marriage to save your sister. He took the final step, dropping to one knee before her on the wet ground, heedless of the mud staining his trousers. He took a cold, trembling hand in both of his. "Elara," he breathed, his voice breaking. "I was wrong. about everything, my life at Blackwood. It wasn't peaceful solitude. It was a barren, empty wasteland. I thought I needed a duchess, a manager for my home. I was a fool. It wasn't a duchess I needed. It was you. The warmth, the strength, the light that I saw in you that night in the storm. The light I tried so desperately to extinguish because it scared me. He looked up at her, his face streaked with rain and tears, his carefully constructed world shattered at her feet. I know I have no right to ask. I know the pain I've caused you. But I have to say it if only once. That loveless marriage, the cold bargain we made, it has become my entire world. Forgive me, Elara, because I have fallen in love with you, and the thought of returning to that empty life, of living another day in that house without you. I can't do it. His voice dropped to a raw, desperate whisper that was nearly lost in the sound of the rain. I cannot live without you. Elara stared down at him, at the proud, untouchable Duke of Blackwood, kneeling in the mud before her, his heart laid open. The anger and the hurt that had been her shield for days began to dissolve under the heat of his confession. She saw not the man who had wounded her, but the man who had been wounded long ago, and had finally painfully found his way out of the dark. Her own tears began to fall, mingling with the rain on her cheeks. In that small, forgotten London garden, surrounded by the storm, two broken hearts finally had a chance to become one. Elara's tears were not of sorrow, but of release. The confession she had never dared to dream of hung in the air more real and resonant than the rain that soaked them both. She reached out her fingers, tracing the line of his jaw a touch that was both a question and an absolution. "Get up, Alistair," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You will catch your death of cold." He rose his hands, still holding hers, his eyes searching her face, desperate for a sign. What he found there was not the cool dismissal he feared, but the tremulous beginnings of a shared future. She didn't pull away. In that moment, the garden ceased to be a backdrop for confessions and became the foundation of a new beginning. Their return to Blackwood Manor was entirely different from their first arrival. They travelled not as a duke and his purchased duchess, but as a man and a woman who had glimpsed each other's souls. The silence in the carriage was no longer tense, but comfortable, filled with unspoken promises. Julian Croft was waiting for them, a smug, proprietary air about him. He had seen Alistair's hasty departure to London as a sign that the marriage was irrevocably broken. He expected the Duke to return alone, ready to begin the lengthy and scandalous process of an annulment. He found them entering the great hall together, Elara's hand resting naturally in the crook of Alistair's arm. The easy intimacy between them was a visible shock, wiping the welcoming smile from Julian's face. "Alistair and Your Grace," he stammered. "We were not expecting you both back so soon." "I trust Miss Vance's health has improved. Rosalie is recovering. Thank you, Julian." Alistair said, his voice as cold and hard as granite. He stopped before his cousin, his height and presence utterly dominating. "But we have other more pressing matters to discuss. My solicitor, Mr. Althorpe, has been most diligent in his work. He sends his regards." The colour drained from Julian's face. He knew the name. He knew what it meant. He traced a payment. Alistair continued, his voice, low and menacing, to a private investigator named Finch. "A payment made by your valet on your behalf. A payment for information intended to destroy my marriage." Julian sputtered, trying to form a denial. "Alistair, this is a misunderstanding. A fabrication by your wife to turn you against your own blood." "My wife," Alistair said, his grip tightening protectively on Elara's arm, "is the most honourable person I have ever known. She stood by a bargain we made. You, on the other hand, used my deepest grief as a tool for your own ambition. You twisted my past to poison my future. You are no blood of mine." He turned to the butler, who had been watching the scene with wide, impassive eyes. "Mr. Jennings, have Mr. Croft's belongings packed immediately. He is to be out of this house within the hour. He is never to set foot on any of my properties again. His allowance is terminated effective immediately. He is no longer welcome here." The dismissal was absolute, brutal, and public. Julian stripped of his prospects, and his dignity paled, his charming facade crumbling to reveal the bitter, grasping man beneath. He shot a look of pure hatred at Elara, then turned and stalked away without another word. The cancer had been cut out. That evening, Alistair led Elara not to the library or the dining hall, but up to the East Wing gallery. He stood before the portrait of his brother and Isabella. For a long time, he just looked at it, the grief on his face still present, but different now. It was a scar, not an open wound. "I see now," he said quietly, "that I mourned what I thought I lost, not what I truly had. I loved my brother, but I was envious of his freedom, his easy charm. And Isabella. I think I was more in love with the idea of her, the idea of having a perfect life, than I ever was with the woman herself. Her betrayal gave me an excuse to become the man I was always afraid I'd be: cold, solitary, and safe." He turned to Elara, his eyes clear and certain. "You made me feel unsafe, Elara. You made me feel anything at all, and it terrified me. But it also woke me up." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. He opened it to reveal a ring, a magnificent diamond, surrounded by deep blue sapphires that matched her eyes. It was not the simple gold band he had placed on her finger at their wedding. This was something chosen, something personal. Our marriage began as a contract, a business arrangement. He said, his voice full of a sincerity she never thought she'd hear. "I would like it to begin again. Right here, right now. Not as a duke proposing to a debutante, but as Alistair Beaumont, a man who loves you more than he thought it was possible to love anyone, asking you, Elara Vance, if you will do him the truest honor and be his wife in heart and soul for all of our days." Tears streamed down Elara's face as she nodded, unable to speak. "Yes," she finally managed to whisper. "Oh, yes." He slipped the ring onto her finger. It was a perfect fit. He then gently took her face in his hands and kissed her. It was not a hesitant, uncertain kiss like the one they had shared at the altar. This was a kiss of homecoming, of promises kept, and a future finally claimed. It was a kiss that sealed not a bargain, but a bond forged in desperation, tested by betrayal, and finally blessedly sanctified by love. The Iron Duke had found his heart, and the fortune hunter had found a treasure far greater than gold. And so, the story of Elara and Alistair wasn't just about a marriage of convenience. It became a testament to the fact that even the most calculated bargains can be redeemed by the unpredictable power of the human heart. From the cold transaction in a London library to a desperate confession in the rain, their journey reminds us that true wealth is not found in fortunes or titles, but in the courage to face our own ghosts and the strength to trust another. They prove that sometimes the greatest treasures are hidden behind the most impenetrable walls, waiting for the right person to find the key. What did you think of Elara's sacrifice and Alistair's transformation? Could you forgive him for his mistrust? Let me know in the comments below. If you were captivated by their story of love against all odds, please give this video a like, share it with a fellow romance lover, and be sure to subscribe to our channel for more historical tales that sweep you off your feet. Thank you for listening.